Hey, quick hello. This is an original story from Hidden Revenge Family, and it took a turn you truly didn't see coming. Let's get into it.
I almost didn't go to Amber's celebration. Not because I was busy. The base had already wrapped up most operations for the evening. My reports were filed. The compliance logs were clean. Technically, I had nothing better to do, but experience had taught me something simple about family events when Amber was involved. If Amber was hosting it, someone was going to get humiliated. Most of the time, that someone was me. The party was held at a private event hall just outside the base. Amber liked places that looked expensive enough to photograph well, the kind with polished floors, tall glass walls, and waiters who carried trays like they were part of the decor. 30 years in service. That was the official reason for the celebration. Amber had been telling everyone it was a milestone in leadership. I parked my car next to a line of black SUVs and walked in wearing the same dark blue dress I'd worn to 3 other formal events that year. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to make a statement. Amber didn't believe in quiet clothing. Amber believed in entrances. When I stepped inside, I spotted her immediately. She was standing in the center of the room, under a row of soft gold lights, wearing a white evening dress that probably cost more than my car payment. Her hair was styled perfectly. Her smile was wide and bright, the kind that appeared whenever someone important walked within 10 feet of her. Around her stood a circle of officers and contractors, most of them laughing at something she had just said. Amber thrived in rooms like that. I preferred offices. Not because I disliked people, I just preferred systems that followed rules. Rooms full of ambition usually didn't. My mother noticed me first. "Martha," someone said, nodding toward me. My mother turned, looked me over for half a second, and gave the same polite smile she used when greeting distant relatives at weddings. "Oh good," she said. "Sloane made it." That was her entire reaction. No hug, no excitement, just confirmation that the second daughter had arrived. My father gave me a short nod from his chair near the bar. "Evening," he said. "Evening." That was our full conversation. Amber finally spotted me when one of the contractors whispered something in her ear. Her eyes slid across the room, landed on me, and her smile sharpened slightly. That look always meant the same thing. Entertainment had arrived. "Sloane," she called out loudly enough that half the room turned. I walked over calmly. Amber placed one hand dramatically on my shoulder as I reached the group. "Everyone," she announced, "this is my little sister." The officers around her turned politely. Amber tilted her head toward me with a grin. "She works in base logistics compliance." Then she laughed. "You know, the person who counts bolts and checks paperwork so the rest of us can actually do real work." A few people chuckled. One of the contractors smiled awkwardly. I nodded slightly. That's one way to describe it. Amber waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, come on, Sloane, don't be modest. You're excellent at it." She leaned toward a colonel standing next to her. She once wrote a 15-page report about a missing shipment of washers. The colonel raised an eyebrow. "Washers?" Amber nodded proudly. 300 of them. More laughter. I sipped my water and waited. Amber enjoyed warming up a crowd, but she always saved the best line for last. And the best part, she continued, is that Sloane actually likes that job. She looked directly at me. "You like quiet rooms and spreadsheets more than people." "That's not accurate," I said calmly. Amber tilted her head. "Oh really?" I shrugged. "I also like clean audits." A few people smirked. Amber's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Then she wrapped an arm around my shoulders, like we were suddenly the closest sisters in the world. "You know what the funny thing is," she told the group. "Sloane has always been like this." She gestured up and down at me. "Same practical clothes, same serious face, same rules matter more than fun personality." Someone asked jokingly, "Does she ever relax?" Amber laughed. "That's the thing. I don't think she knows how." She leaned closer to them like she was sharing a secret. If you locked Sloane in a room with 100 people and a stack of compliance forms, she'd talk to the paperwork first. The room laughed again. I watched Amber carefully. Her eyes were bright, confident. She loved audiences, and audiences loved confidence. Then Amber raised her glass. "You know what I've always told her?" The room quieted slightly. Amber looked straight at me with that polished smile. "Sloane, I've always said you're brilliant in your own way." I nodded. "Thank you." She shook her head. No, let me finish." Her voice became louder. "But you're never going to find someone." The laughter stopped. Now people were listening. Amber continued smoothly. "Look at her." She gestured toward me again. "She works in compliance. She dresses like she's going to a safety inspection, and she corrects people's paperwork at family dinners. A few nervous chuckles. Amber raised her glass again and delivered the line she had clearly practiced. I'm going to build a beautiful life, a house, a family, the whole picture. Then she looked straight at me. But you, Sloane, her smile widened. You're going to grow old alone in some quiet office full of binders because no one can handle how boring you are. The room went completely silent. Someone shifted uncomfortably. A waiter paused near the bar. Amber looked pleased with herself. She took a sip of champagne like she had just delivered a brilliant toast. I stood there calmly. No anger. No embarrassment. Just silence. Because Amber didn't know something. She had spent years assuming my life was small. Years believing that I lived quietly in a government apartment with nothing but reports and audit logs. Years believing that I stayed single because no one wanted someone like me. The truth was simpler. I had chosen silence. And the reason for that silence was sitting several ranks above everyone in that room. Amber set down her glass. Well, she said, you're awfully quiet. I gave a small shrug. You seem confident about predicting my future. Amber laughed. Come on, Sloane, be honest. She leaned closer. You don't even date. I didn't answer. She tilted her head again. You've never even brought someone to a family event. That's true, I said. Amber spread her arms dramatically toward the room. Exactly. Then she delivered the final line with a confident smile. You'll never find anyone. For a moment, I simply watched her. Then I glanced around the room. Officers, contractors, family, all of them waiting for a reaction. I gave them the only response that made sense. A small nod. You might be right. Amber looked satisfied. She turned back toward her guests, already shifting the conversation to her next promotion opportunity. But I remained standing there for another second. Because the most interesting thing about predictions is that they only work when people know the full story. And Amber didn't, not even close. Before we move on, let me ask you something. Have you ever been the most capable person in the room, but everyone treated you like the quiet one who just brings the paperwork? If that's ever happened to you, tell me in the comments. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair and slipped out of the party before Amber noticed. No dramatic exit, no argument. Just the quiet sound of the door closing behind me. The night air outside was cool and calm. The kind that makes the base feel almost peaceful. After a loud room full of people pretending to enjoy each other, I walked across the parking lot and sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. Amber's voice was still echoing in my head. You'll never find anyone. It would have been a great prediction if it had been true. 5 years earlier, my life had already taken a direction Amber would never have believed. Back then, Maverick Vance wasn't a general yet. He was a colonel, and the first time we met, he had absolutely no idea who I was. I was assigned to audit a logistics pipeline for a joint operations supply program. It was the kind of job that required long hours, detailed reports, and the ability to tell powerful people that their systems had problems. Not everyone appreciated that. Colonel Vance did. The first time we spoke was in a conference room filled with supply officers who were trying very hard to explain away missing documentation. I presented the report. Calmly, clearly. 3 shipments had bypassed verification protocols. 2 inventory chains had incomplete tracking logs. 1 contractor had signed documents that didn't match the shipping manifests. When I finished, the room was silent. One of the officers tried to dismiss it. Those are small issues, he said. Colonel Vance leaned back in his chair. Then he asked a single question. Captain Sloane, if those shipments had contained weapons instead of equipment, would those still be small issues? I looked directly at him. No, sir. He nodded slowly. That's what I thought. After the meeting ended, he stopped me in the hallway. You're the first person in that room who answered directly, he said. That's usually the safest way to answer, I replied. He studied me for a moment. Most people try to avoid making enemies. I try to avoid mistakes. That was the moment our conversation started. At first it was professional. He respected systems. I respected leaders who actually read the reports they asked for. Our discussions became longer over time. Supply chains, operational planning, military bureaucracy, and occasionally the strange ways people behave when rank becomes more important than responsibility. 6 months later, we had dinner for the first time. It wasn't dramatic, no violin music. Just 2 people who were both very good at their jobs and surprisingly comfortable talking to each other. Another 6 months passed before we admitted something obvious. We worked well together, in every sense of the phrase. The decision to get married came quietly, no announcement, no celebration, just a courthouse ceremony with 2 witnesses and a signed document. The decision to keep it private came immediately afterward. And that decision wasn't about secrecy. It was about fairness. Maverick said it first. If people know you're married to me, they'll assume every promotion you earn came from my name. I had already been thinking the same thing. I'd rather build my own record. He nodded. So would I. That was the agreement. No public announcements, no shared events, no professional overlap unless necessary. To everyone else in the system, we were simply 2 officers in separate divisions. Our marriage existed outside the spotlight. And honestly, we both preferred it that way. Our schedules were already chaotic. Deployments, assignments, inspections. The military didn't exactly design life to be convenient. But when we had time together, it was quiet and normal. Dinner at home, long conversations about work, occasional arguments about whose turn it was to cook. The kind of life that doesn't impress anyone on social media, but actually works in the real world. Amber would have found it unbearably boring. Amber believed success had to be visible. 5 years ago, while I was filing audit reports and building a career, one evaluation at a time, Amber was building something very different. A lifestyle. She had always been good at networking. And by networking, I mean she knew how to make people feel like they were attending the most important event of their week. Amber hosted dinners, cocktail parties, charity events, promotion celebrations. Half the officers in her circle had been through her living room at least once. Those events looked impressive. The photos were even more impressive. What most people didn't see was how those events were funded. Our parents helped. A lot. Amber has potential, my mother used to say. She just needs support right now. Support in this case meant money, new furniture, event catering, decorations, clothing. Amber called it professional investment. My father called it temporary assistance. I called it math that didn't add up. Meanwhile, my own life looked very simple from the outside. I lived in a standard government apartment near the base, 1 bedroom, functional furniture, a kitchen that had exactly what I needed and nothing else. Amber saw that apartment once. She walked in, looked around, and laughed. "You live like a college student." "It's practical," I said. She opened the refrigerator. "You don't even have wine. I don't drink during the week." She shook her head like she had discovered something tragic. "Sloan, you're 30 years old and living like a supply clerk." What Amber didn't know was that my tiny government apartment wasn't the only place I lived. It was simply the only place people on base knew about. Maverick had his own residence across town. We spent time there when schedules allowed, but we kept the 2 lives separate. The system worked. My career moved forward on merit. His moved forward on command performance. No shortcuts, no favors, just records. Amber, of course, interpreted my quiet life very differently. In her version of the story, I was the dependent one, the sister who never moved up, the one who stayed in the background counting bolts and reviewing paperwork. She told that story often, usually at parties, usually while holding expensive champagne. The irony was that Amber believed she was the successful one, the admired one, the rising officer building connections across the command structure. And in fairness, she was good at attracting attention. But attention and stability are 2 very different things, and systems built on appearances tend to fail eventually. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. Amber's words from the party replayed again. "You'll never find anyone." I drove toward the base entrance, watching the quiet road stretch ahead under the dim streetlights. Amber thought she understood my life. She thought she had the whole picture. What she didn't realize was that the most important part of that picture had never been visible to her. And very soon, that was going to become a problem. The next morning, I was reviewing a shipment compliance log when Amber's name appeared on my screen. Not in a message, in a project file. That alone was unusual. Amber didn't normally deal with logistics systems unless she was hosting an event that required catering permits. Seeing her name attached to a strategic supply proposal was like seeing a fashion influencer suddenly applying for a mechanical engineering job. I opened the file, Project Disruptive Logistics Initiative, budget request, $50 million. I leaned back slightly in my chair. That was not a small project. Programs that size didn't move unless someone high in the command structure was interested. I scrolled through the summary. The idea itself wasn't ridiculous. The proposal suggested restructuring several supply routes, consolidating vendor chains, and implementing predictive inventory tracking to reduce transport delays. In theory, it could save money long-term. In practice, projects like this usually collapsed under their own complexity, especially when the person pitching them didn't understand the system they were trying to redesign. I kept reading, then I noticed something more interesting: the approval chain. The proposal wasn't going through Amber's normal department. It was scheduled for review directly under Strategic Command oversight. That meant a general officer would be making the final decision. Amber had somehow positioned herself in front of someone very powerful. That explained the sudden enthusiasm. About an hour later, the answer walked into my office wearing white. Amber loved dramatic entrances. She stood in the doorway like she expected a camera crew to appear behind her. White uniform jacket, perfectly pressed. Amber always dressed like she was attending a promotion ceremony, even when she was just walking down a hallway. "Well," she said brightly, "look who's busy counting paperwork again." I didn't look up from my screen immediately. "I'm reviewing supply chain documentation." She stepped inside and leaned against my desk. "I saw your name attached to the logistics database access list." "That's my job," Amber smiled. "Which is exactly why I'm here." I closed the file. "What do you need?" She crossed her arms proudly. "I've been assigned a strategic initiative." I waited. She lifted her chin slightly. $50 million, congratulations. Amber watched my face carefully. "You're not impressed." "I'm waiting for the operational plan." Amber laughed. "You've always been like this. No excitement." Then she leaned forward slightly. "It's called the Disruptive Logistics Initiative." I read the summary. Her smile widened. "Of course you did." Amber circled slowly around the chair in front of my desk, like she was presenting something on stage. "This project is going to change how supply systems operate across the region." "That's a large claim. It's a large project." She placed both hands on the back of the chair. "Once it's approved, I'll be leading the implementation team." I nodded. "That's ambitious." Amber's eyes sparkled. "You know what comes after leading a program that size?" I didn't answer. She answered for me. "Major." She said the word slowly. Amber had always liked titles, and if the results look good, she continued, that opens doors for command positions later. I turned my monitor slightly. "Have you reviewed the compliance requirements?" Amber waved a dismissive hand. "That's why people like you exist. I'm serious." "I know." She smiled again. "But the good news is that I do not actually have to convince a committee." I paused. "Who's reviewing it?" Amber's voice lowered slightly. "Strategic Command." That meant a general officer. "Which one?" I asked. She shrugged. "They won't tell me." I studied her. "You're pitching a $50 million operational restructuring plan to someone you've never met. That's how these things work. Usually the project lead at least understands the evaluation criteria." Amber leaned forward. "Oh, I understand one thing very clearly." "What's that?" "The general reviewing this proposal has a reputation for what?" She grinned. "Being extremely difficult." That didn't surprise me. Senior command usually was. Amber continued. "Apparently he's obsessed with compliance." I raised an eyebrow. "Obsessed." That's the word people used. Amber laughed lightly. "Every report gets checked. Every process gets questioned. Every deviation gets flagged." She pointed at me. "Sounds like your kind of person." I didn't respond. Amber continued talking. "He doesn't care about presentation or networking. That's unusual. He cares about whether the system actually works. That's less unusual than you think." Amber straightened. "Well, it doesn't matter. Why not?" She smiled confidently. "Because I know how to pitch." Amber walked over to the whiteboard in my office and grabbed a marker. She wrote 3 words. Vision, efficiency, transformation. Then she stepped back proudly. "Those are the words that matter." I stared at the board. "You're planning to present a logistics restructuring plan using marketing language." Amber laughed. "You really don't understand leadership." I leaned back in my chair. "I understand logistics." She pointed the marker at me. "That's the difference between us. What difference? You focus on the mechanics." She tapped the word vision. "I focus on the future." Amber capped the marker and set it down. "This general may love compliance, but even generals understand momentum." I considered that for a moment. Then I asked a simple question. "Have you read the base compliance protocols that apply to this project?" Amber sighed dramatically. "Sloan." "Yes, you worry too much about rules." I didn't answer. Amber stepped toward the door. "But don't worry," she added casually. "I'll get access to whatever documents I need." "How?" She smiled over her shoulder. Oh, I have friends. That didn't surprise me either. Amber believed relationships solved everything. As she reached the doorway, she turned back one last time. Oh, and one more thing. What? When I meet that general and secure approval, her smile widened again. You might finally get to see what real success looks like. She walked out before I could respond. The door closed behind her. I sat there for a moment staring at the 3 words she had written on my board. Vision, efficiency, transformation. None of them were operational terms. None of them solved logistics problems. But Amber believed confidence could replace structure. I opened the project file again and scrolled through the approval chain. The reviewing authority was still listed only as strategic command. No name, no rank, just a clearance level. Amber was right about one thing. Whoever was reviewing that proposal cared deeply about compliance. And if Amber planned to impress that person with presentation slides and confident speeches, this project was about to become very interesting. 2 days later, I was standing at the base access control station when the convoy arrived. Gate duty wasn't technically part of my daily routine, but compliance officers rotated through the security checkpoints regularly. It was the fastest way to see how well procedures actually worked when people weren't expecting an audit. And procedures tend to fall apart when someone important is in a hurry. That morning was quiet at first. A few supply trucks came through, 2 maintenance vehicles, 1 civilian contractor van with the correct paperwork. Normal traffic. Then 3 black SUVs pulled up to the gate together. That wasn't normal. Convoys always drew attention, especially when the drivers looked impatient before they even rolled down their windows. The lead driver handed a document to the guard. The guard scanned it, frowned slightly, and passed it to me. Captain, he said quietly. They're requesting expedited access. I took the paperwork. Temporary contractor entry request. Incomplete verification stamps. No pre-cleared vendor codes. No security screening confirmation. I looked up. How many people in the vehicles? 8 total, ma'am, the guard replied. And cargo unknown. That alone was enough to stop the process. Unknown cargo doesn't enter a military base without inspection. I stepped toward the lead vehicle. Good morning, I said calmly. The driver looked irritated already. We're late for what a presentation, that's not a clearance category. He sighed. We're with Captain Amber Hayes. That explained the attitude. Amber liked making people feel like rules were optional. I nodded. Please pull the vehicles to the inspection lane. The driver stared at me. That's not necessary. It is today. We have authorization. You have a request, I said. Not authorization. The man leaned closer to the window. Captain Hayes said this would be handled. It is being handled. I pointed toward the inspection area. Over there. The driver muttered something under his breath and started the engine. The 3 SUVs moved slowly toward the inspection lane. One of the soldiers beside me whispered, Someone's not going to like that. He was right. Amber arrived 10 minutes later. Her car pulled up fast, stopped halfway across the access line, and she stepped out before the engine even shut off. She was wearing the same white uniform jacket again. Apparently, the white swan theme had become permanent. Amber walked straight toward the inspection lane and saw the 3 SUVs parked there with their doors open while soldiers checked cargo cases. Her expression changed instantly. Sloan. She marched toward me across the pavement like the ground owed her money. What is this standard inspection? Amber pointed at the vehicles. They're with me. That's why they're being inspected. Amber looked at the soldiers. Stop the inspection. No one moved. Because technically she didn't have the authority to override base security procedures. She turned back to me. You're holding my partners at the gate. They arrived without proper clearance. They're approved contractors. The paperwork doesn't show that. Amber crossed her arms. This is a strategic project. All base entry is strategic. She leaned closer. Sloan, you're delaying an operational meeting. I kept my voice level. They'll enter the base when the inspection is complete. Amber laughed sharply. You really don't understand how this works. I understand the regulations. Amber turned toward the soldiers again. You can stop searching those cases now. One of them glanced at me. I gave a small shake of my head. The search continued. Amber's patience finally snapped. She spun back toward me. You're doing this on purpose. No. Yes, you are. Amber stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly. You're jealous. That wasn't new. Amber had been calling me jealous since we were teenagers. I'm enforcing procedure, I said. You're sabotaging me. The soldiers nearby had become very quiet. Everyone on a base recognizes the moment when a conversation stops being professional. Amber pointed toward the convoy. That team is here to finalize my presentation for Strategic Command. That doesn't change inspection requirements. Her voice rose. You think rules matter more than results. Rules prevent disasters. Amber threw her hands up. This is exactly why no one puts you in charge of real operations. I didn't answer. Amber stepped even closer. You're a compliance officer. Yes. You check paperwork. That's correct. Amber laughed loudly enough for half the checkpoint to hear. You're basically a bureaucrat with a uniform. A couple soldiers looked uncomfortable. I remained calm. Amber leaned in close enough that only I could hear the first sentence. You know what's going to happen when this project is approved, what? Her voice became louder again so everyone could hear. I'll be working directly with General Vance. The name hung in the air for a moment. Amber clearly enjoyed saying it. And when that happens, she continued proudly, I'll have the authority to restructure operations across this base. I nodded slowly. That's ambitious. Amber's smile turned sharp. The first thing I'll do, she pointed directly at my chest, is request your transfer. A few soldiers exchanged glances. Amber raised her voice again. You're an outdated officer who hides behind procedures because you're too afraid to lead. She waved her hand toward the gate. When I'm done with this project, people like you won't be slowing down progress anymore. She took a step back and delivered the final line like it was a public announcement. You're nothing but a low-level officer stuck in the past. Silence settled across the checkpoint. I watched Amber for a moment. Then I reached into my folder and pulled out a standard incident report form. Amber blinked. What are you doing documenting the situation? You're writing a report. Yes. Amber laughed again. Of course you are. She shook her head dramatically. This is why you'll never move up. I filled in the first section calmly. Date. Time, location, nature of incident. Amber folded her arms. You think paperwork will protect you? I continued writing. Unauthorized attempt to bypass security protocol. Amber scoffed. You're unbelievable. I finished the report, signed it, and handed a copy to the guard station. Then I looked back at Amber. The inspection will be completed in approximately 12 minutes. Her eyes narrowed. You're enjoying this, no? Amber leaned closer again. You have no idea who you're standing in front of. That part was true, but not in the way she thought. Because Amber believed she was about to impress one of the most powerful officers in the command structure. What she didn't realize was that the name she had just used as a threat belonged to the one person in this entire situation who already knew exactly how seriously I took compliance procedures. 3 hours after the gate incident, I was sitting in a conference room reviewing procurement compliance with 2 supply officers. The meeting itself was routine. We were going through vendor verification procedures and updating documentation for an upcoming audit cycle. Nothing exciting, but halfway through the discussion, my phone buzzed once on the table. Not a call, a security notification. I glanced down briefly. Office workstation accessed. That alone wasn't unusual. The system logged every access attempt automatically. What made it interesting was the timestamp. I wasn't in my office, which meant someone else was. I kept my expression neutral and continued listening while one of the officers explained a discrepancy in maintenance inventory reports. But part of my attention had already shifted. Because the workstation that had just been accessed contained something unusual. About 6 months earlier, I had created a set of internal files that didn't technically belong to any active program. They looked real. They were structured like real operational plans. They used the same formatting as official logistics strategy documents. But they were intentionally wrong. Not obviously wrong. The kind of wrong that only becomes clear after someone with real expertise starts asking questions. I called them the fiction files. They existed for one reason. People occasionally tried to steal compliance documents, usually contractors looking for shortcuts. Sometimes junior officers trying to build presentations they didn't fully understand. So I built a trap, a clean folder, convincing title. Documents that looked impressive but contained small technical errors buried deep inside the logistics calculations. Anyone who copied those files and tried to present them as real strategy would eventually run into problems. I never expected anyone in my own family to test the system. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. I returned to my office slowly, not because I was nervous, because there was no reason to rush. If someone had accessed the files, the system logs already had the record. When I opened my office door, everything looked normal. Chair in place, computer screen dark, no obvious signs of anyone being there. I sat down and logged into the workstation. The security log opened automatically. Access time, 9 minutes. User credentials, Amber Hayes. I leaned back in the chair. That answered the question. Amber hadn't just visited. She had logged in using temporary network access from the base directory system. Technically legal, morally questionable, professionally dangerous. I opened the activity record. Folder accessed Strategic Archives subfolder, opened Patriot Strategic Final. That was one of the fiction file folders. Amber had excellent instincts for impressive-sounding names. She had also copied 3 documents. Full export. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I laughed quietly, not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Amber believed information was power, but she rarely asked where that information came from, or whether it was actually correct. I opened the copied documents to confirm which ones she had taken. File 1, Patriot Strategic Logistics Optimization Model. File 2, Supply Chain Compression Framework. File 3, Rapid Deployment Inventory Theory. They looked impressive. Charts, data tables, operational diagrams. But buried inside those documents were several problems. The inventory distribution model used unrealistic transport capacity assumptions. The route compression plan violated standard redundancy protocols, and the predictive supply algorithm contained a flaw that would collapse under real logistical questioning. None of the errors were obvious, but anyone presenting the plan would eventually face questions they couldn't answer. I closed the files and leaned back again. Amber believed she had just found the missing piece of her presentation. From her perspective, it probably looked like a gift. Detailed logistics frameworks, professional formatting, strategic terminology that sounded exactly like something a general officer might expect. Amber had never built a supply system, but now she had documents that made it look like she had. I checked the access duration again. 9 minutes. That was about how long it would take to copy 3 files and skim the headings, which meant Amber probably didn't read them carefully. That was also predictable. Amber liked conclusions. She rarely studied the details that created them. My office phone rang. I answered. Yes, Amber's voice came through, immediately bright and cheerful. Sloan, Captain Hayes. She laughed lightly. You don't have to sound so formal. I'm at work. So am I waited. Amber spoke again. I stopped by your office earlier. I saw the log entry. Well, she said casually. I needed to review some logistics frameworks. Did you find what you needed? Oh, absolutely. Amber sounded very pleased with herself. You really should organize your files better, by the way. Why? Because I found something extremely useful. That didn't surprise me. I'm glad you found it helpful, Amber continued. You know, for someone who claims to enjoy compliance work, you've been hiding some impressive strategic thinking. I keep notes. Well, your notes just saved me a lot of time. She sounded almost grateful. I was struggling to explain the supply chain compression model for the proposal, were you? But now I've got a perfect framework. Amber lowered her voice slightly like she was sharing a secret. This general I'm pitching to. Apparently he hates vague presentations. That's true. He wants structure, systems, real operational planning. That sounds reasonable. Amber laughed again. Well, thanks to your files, that's exactly what he's going to get. I leaned back in the chair. I'm glad I could help. You didn't help, Amber said proudly. I helped myself. That was also predictable. Amber paused. You know what's funny? What you always act like the smartest person in the room. I don't. But you're terrible at protecting your work. I glanced at the folder on my screen. You might want to read those documents carefully. Amber chuckled. Oh, please, I'm serious. You're just worried I'm about to succeed. I didn't respond. Amber's tone became confident again. Once I present this plan, Strategic Command is going to realize I'm the only officer pushing real innovation. That's one possibility. And when that happens, she continued proudly, this entire base will see what real leadership looks like. The call ended. I sat there quietly for a moment. Amber believed she had just found the key to impressing the general reviewing her project. From her perspective, the plan was perfect. Professional, detailed, strategic, the kind of document that would make any ambitious officer look brilliant. The only problem was that the plan wasn't real. It was fiction. And sooner or later, someone with actual authority over logistics was going to start asking questions. Questions Amber wouldn't be able to answer. I was still thinking about Amber's phone call when Saturday evening arrived. Family dinners at my parents' house had a predictable structure. My mother prepared far more food than 4 people could eat. My father sat quietly at the end of the table and listened. Amber spoke like she was giving a presentation. And somehow I usually ended up being the problem. Their house hadn't changed much since I was in college. Same wooden dining table, same frame photos on the wall. Most of those photos featured Amber. Graduation ceremonies, promotion events, charity galas. There were a few pictures of me too, usually in the background. I arrived a few minutes early and knocked once before walking in. My mother looked up from the kitchen. "Sloan," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "You're early, traffic was light," she nodded. "Amber should be here any minute." That sentence carried the same tone as always. Amber was the event. Everyone else was the audience. My father sat at the table reading something on his phone. He glanced up when I walked in. "Evening, evening." That was the full greeting. I took a seat and poured myself a glass of water. 5 minutes later, the front door opened loudly. Amber entered like she was walking onto a stage. White jacket again. Amber apparently owned multiple versions of the same outfit. She walked straight into the dining room with a confident smile. "Well," she said, setting her purse down. "This has been an interesting week." My mother immediately turned toward her. "How is the project going?" Amber sat down and leaned back in her chair. "It's practically approved already." That got my mother's full attention. "Really?" Amber nodded proudly. "Strategic Command loves innovation." She glanced at me briefly. "Especially when it's backed by real operational planning." I said nothing. My mother began setting plates on the table. "That's wonderful, Amber." "It is." Amber reached for the breadbasket. "You should see the proposal." My father looked up slightly. "What kind of project is it?" "Disruptive logistics restructuring." He blinked. "That sounds expensive. $50 million. My mother gasped quietly. "Oh my," Amber smiled. "And when it's approved, I'll be leading the implementation." "That's amazing," my mother said. Amber leaned back comfortably. "I've been studying the base systems for weeks. That part wasn't exactly accurate. I finally understand how the entire logistics network operates." My father raised an eyebrow. "You weren't in logistics before." Amber waved that away. "Leadership isn't about doing the job. It's about understanding the vision." I watched her calmly. Amber continued speaking like she was addressing a boardroom. "I've got the compliance structure mapped out, supply routes optimized, deployment timelines streamlined." My mother nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds very impressive." Amber turned toward me. "You'd probably find it interesting too, Sloan." I took a sip of water. "I've already seen parts of it." Amber smiled slowly. "Oh, I know." My mother sat down at the table. "Speaking of that," she looked at me with the serious expression she used when she believed she was being fair. "I heard about the situation at the base gate. That didn't take long." Amber leaned back and folded her arms. "That was ridiculous." My mother looked disappointed. "Sloan, why would you embarrass your sister like that?" I followed security procedure. "You delayed her partners. They arrived without clearance." Amber laughed lightly. "There were minor paperwork issues." "Security documentation isn't minor." My mother shook her head. "Sometimes rules need flexibility, not at a military gate." Amber leaned forward. "You held my team outside for 15 minutes. They entered safely. That's not the point." I looked at her calmly. It was exactly the point. Amber rolled her eyes. "You've always been like this." My mother sighed. "Sloan, you should apologize." I looked at her. "For what?" "For making Amber's work harder." Amber nodded slightly. "Exactly." I set my glass down. I enforced protocol. "You humiliated her in front of her partners." "That wasn't my intention." "But it happened," my mother insisted. Amber watched me carefully. "Go ahead," she said. "You can say sorry." I didn't move. Amber smiled. "See? This is why people find you difficult." I studied her for a moment. Then I spoke. "If you use that plan in your presentation," Amber tilted her head, "you're going to destroy your own career." The table went quiet. My mother looked confused. "What plan?" Amber laughed immediately. "Oh, this again." I kept my voice calm. "I'm serious." Amber leaned forward, smiling like she had just caught someone lying. "You're warning me now?" "Yes." My mother looked between us. "Sloan, what are you talking about?" Amber waved her hand dismissively. "She's just jealous. That's not accurate." Amber laughed louder. "You think I don't understand what's happening?" I said nothing. Amber leaned closer across the table. You found out I'm about to pitch a major project. Yes. And suddenly you're concerned about my career. I'm concerned about the data you're using. Amber shook her head. You're worried because someone important is finally listening to me. That's not the issue. Amber smiled in a way that meant she was about to enjoy the next sentence. You know what the real problem is, Sloan? What no one is asking you to pitch anything. My mother looked uncomfortable. Amber continued anyway. No one invites compliance officers into strategic presentations. She leaned back in her chair. They invite leaders. My father watched silently. Amber crossed her arms. You're jealous because I'm sitting across from a general next week. I held her gaze. If you present those files, you won't survive the questions. Amber laughed again. That's adorable. I stayed calm. I'm giving you a chance to walk away. Amber leaned forward again. From what? From making a mistake. She shook her head slowly. You're trying very hard to sound important. I'm trying to help you. Amber smiled with complete confidence. No, she pointed slightly toward me. You're jealous because no one wants someone like you in the room. I didn't respond. Amber finished the sentence with a quiet laugh. No one wants a useless officer pitching ideas. The room stayed silent for a moment. Then Amber delivered the final line like it was obvious. That's the difference between us. She took a sip of wine. People actually want to hear from me. I closed the audit software and stared at the numbers for a few seconds. Numbers are honest in a way people rarely are. They don't flatter anyone. They don't make speeches. They simply sit there and tell you what actually happened. And what had happened inside Amber's project accounts was impressive. Not in the way Amber would have hoped. I leaned forward and reopened the expense trail. Every large program on the base ran through several financial channels: operations funding, vendor payments, logistics support budgets. All of it passed through compliance review at some point. That's where my job lived. Most officers thought compliance was about paperwork. It wasn't. It was about patterns. Patterns in how money moved. Patterns in how approvals appeared. Patterns in the small decisions people believed no one would notice. Amber had made one mistake. She believed that because the project was large, the details wouldn't matter. $50 million attracts attention, but oddly enough, the mistakes were small. The first charge appeared 3 weeks earlier. A consultation dinner, vendor relations expense, $900. That was high, but not impossible. The second charge was more interesting. Clothing purchase, $2,300, listed under presentation preparation. I stared at the receipt record. Amber had charged a formal evening outfit to the project budget. Apparently in Amber's world, wardrobe counted as operational equipment. I kept scrolling. Another vendor dinner, another clothing purchase, a private driver service, a catering deposit. Each one individually small enough to avoid immediate alarms. But together the pattern was obvious. Amber wasn't just promoting the project. She was funding her lifestyle with it. I leaned back and folded my arms. Technically, I didn't need to investigate further. Misuse of operational funds automatically triggered compliance authority, which meant I had the ability to stop the financial flow immediately. I opened the authorization panel. 3 accounts connected to Amber's project appeared on the screen: Project Operations Fund, Vendor Preparation Budget, Strategic Presentation Allocation. I hovered over the control options for a moment. Then I selected the only one that mattered. Temporary freeze, compliance review pending the system asked for confirmation. I typed a short explanation. Irregular financial activity detected. Pending audit verification. Then I pressed confirm. Within 5 seconds, the accounts locked. Any attempt to charge expenses against them would now return a denial message. I closed the screen. Amber was scheduled to present the proposal to Strategic Command in less than 24 hours, which meant she would probably discover the freeze very soon. My office phone rang 12 minutes later. I answered. Yes. Amber's voice exploded through the speaker. What did you do? I glanced at the monitor calmly. Good afternoon, Amber. You froze my accounts. Yes, you can't do that. I just did. Amber's breathing was sharp and fast. Do you have any idea what you've done? Yes, I have vendors arriving tonight. That will be difficult now. Amber almost shouted. This is sabotage. No, it absolutely is. I opened the audit log again. You used operational funding for personal purchases. That's not personal. Clothing usually is. It was for the presentation. Clothes aren't a logistics expense. Amber paused. Then her voice lowered slightly. You're doing this because of the gate incident. No, you're still angry. I'm reviewing financial records. Amber laughed bitterly. You're unbelievable. I didn't respond. Amber continued. You're trying to destroy my project. Your project is under audit. You don't have that authority. Actually, I said calmly, I do. The silence on the other end lasted a few seconds. Amber knew I wasn't bluffing. Compliance officers rarely bluff. She spoke again. You need to reverse this. After the audit. I have a meeting with Strategic Command tomorrow. I'm aware. I need those accounts active. You needed them yesterday. Amber slammed something loudly on her side of the call. This is ridiculous. I disagree. Amber's voice sharpened. If that presentation succeeds, none of this will matter. That's not how financial law works. Amber laughed again. You think a few receipts will stop a $50 million program? Number it exactly. Amber sounded calmer now, more confident. You're panicking because you know what happens tomorrow. What happens tomorrow? I walk into that room with the strongest logistics proposal they've seen all year. I didn't interrupt. And when that general approves the project, she continued proudly. The command structure will shift overnight. That's optimistic. Amber ignored that. When that happens, I'll be overseeing the implementation team. She paused slightly. And guess which department gets reorganized first? I leaned back in the chair. Compliance exactly. Amber's voice carried quiet satisfaction. You're freezing accounts today. She let the sentence hang. But tomorrow I'll be running the entire program. That's one possible outcome. Amber chuckled. You really should learn how power works. I understand it fairly well. Then you should know something. What's that? She lowered her voice again. If the general signs off on my plan. Amber sounded completely certain. Every little problem you're creating right now disappears. That wasn't accurate, but Amber believed it. Because Amber believed success erased mistakes. She believed authority rewrote rules. She believed confidence could outrun accountability. Amber finished the conversation with a calm tone. Enjoy your paperwork, Sloan. The call ended. I sat there quietly for a moment. Amber was right about one thing. Tomorrow would decide a lot. She believed her presentation would solve everything. But presentations are fragile things. They look powerful until someone starts asking the wrong questions. And tomorrow, Amber wasn't pitching her plan to a room full of people who cared about confidence. She was walking into a room where someone cared about details. I was already seated in the back corner of the operations conference room when Amber walked in. Strategic Command briefings always happened in the same building. Thick walls, long table, a screen large enough to display satellite images if necessary. Most people imagine these meetings as dramatic events. In reality, they were quiet. Professionals asking uncomfortable questions. Amber entered the room like it was a stage. White uniform again. Perfect posture. 2 civilian partners followed her carrying laptops and folders. Amber looked around the room confidently. Several logistics officers were already seated. A colonel from procurement. 2 senior supply analysts. Amber smiled at them all like she had already won. She didn't notice me at first. That was expected. I had taken a chair against the wall near the rear display panel. Compliance officers rarely sat at the center table. We sat where we could observe. Amber connected her laptop to the projector. The first slide appeared. Disruptive Logistics Initiative. Large letters, bold colors, the kind of slide that looked impressive from a distance. Amber began speaking immediately. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm presenting a strategic restructuring plan that will modernize our entire logistics framework. Her voice was confident. Amber was very good at speaking in rooms. Current supply networks operate on outdated redundancy models, she continued. My proposal introduces a compressed routing structure designed to maximize efficiency and reduce transport delay. She clicked to the next slide. Charts appeared. Some of them looked familiar. Because I had written them, or more accurately, I had written the incorrect versions of them. Amber continued. This system uses predictive inventory modeling combined with supply chain compression protocols. One of the analysts leaned forward slightly. Captain Hayes, he said politely, could you clarify the transport capacity assumptions in your distribution model? Amber smiled. Of course. She gestured toward the chart. We analyzed regional supply flow patterns and identified areas where route redundancy can be reduced. That part is clear, the analyst said. He tapped the table with his pen. But your model assumes transport capacity at levels that exceed our current fleet limits. Amber paused briefly, only for a second. Then she nodded confidently. Yes, but those numbers reflect projected optimization after implementation. The analyst frowned slightly. Projected based on what? Amber switched slides. Operational flexibility. That wasn't an answer. Another officer spoke. Captain Hayes, your route compression plan eliminates 3 redundancy checkpoints. Yes, that creates a single point of failure. Amber smiled again. The goal is efficiency. The officer looked at the diagram again. Efficiency usually includes contingency planning. Amber nodded. That will be addressed during implementation. A quiet murmur moved through the room. The analysts were starting to read the numbers more carefully. Amber continued speaking quickly. The important thing is that this system will transform how logistics operations function across the region. One of the supply specialists raised a hand. Where did you develop this framework? Amber answered immediately. Through internal research. Which department? Amber hesitated for half a second. Strategic analysis. That wasn't a department name. The specialist turned slightly toward the screen. These predictive inventory calculations. He tapped the document displayed on the screen. They contain a supply redistribution loop that would collapse under real transport delays. Amber kept smiling. That's why we call it disruptive logistics. That sentence made several people exchange looks. Amber sensed the shift and began speaking faster. The key idea here is innovation. Our current systems are too slow, too rigid. This proposal introduces momentum into supply operations. Momentum wasn't a logistics term. The procurement colonel finally spoke. Captain Hayes. Yes, sir. Your plan removes 2 verification checkpoints and 1 inspection stage. That's correct. How do you maintain compliance oversight? Amber paused again. Through streamlined reporting. That's not a system. Amber clicked to another slide. This diagram demonstrates how supply flow becomes more responsive under the new framework. The colonel studied it. Then he looked up. Your redistribution model assumes uninterrupted transport access across 3 restricted zones. Amber kept smiling. Yes, that's impossible during training rotations. Amber's voice became slightly tighter. We anticipate adjustments. Another analyst leaned forward. Captain Hayes, who reviewed these calculations. Amber straightened. My team. Which logistics unit? Amber hesitated again. Then she said the worst possible thing. Independent strategic research. The room went quiet. Because everyone there understood something very simple. No real logistics officer uses that phrase. Questions began coming faster. Where are the supply delay models? Why are vendor verification stages removed? How do you prevent inventory shortages under this compression structure? Amber answered each one with confident language. But not with actual answers. She used phrases like innovation efficiency and forward thinking. Those words work well in presentations. They work less well when people are checking the math. Then the conference room door opened. Everyone turned. A tall officer stepped inside. 4 stars on the uniform. General Maverick Vance. The room stood immediately. Amber straightened quickly. Her entire expression changed. Excitement, recognition, opportunity. She stepped forward with a bright smile. General Vance, sir. Perfect timing. The general didn't say anything yet. Amber continued confidently. I was just presenting the logistics transformation plan. She gestured toward the screen. This initiative is designed to make our command structure stronger. The general walked further into the room slowly. Amber's voice became warmer, almost flattering. Sir, I believe this program will make the entire command proud. Then she added something she clearly believed sounded impressive. I've prepared everything so our command family can be proud of the results. The general didn't look at her, not once. Instead, he scanned the room calmly. Then his eyes moved toward the back wall, toward my chair. He walked directly past Amber, past the conference table, past the screen, and stopped beside me. The room was completely silent. He leaned down slightly and spoke quietly, only loud enough for the room to hear the first word. Valkyrie. That was not a name anyone in that room knew. It was a private call sign, mine. Then he continued calmly. Your audit report on this unit was disappointing. I nodded once. Yes, sir. Amber was still standing near the screen, confused, frozen, because the general hadn't acknowledged her presentation, hadn't asked a question, hadn't even looked at the slides. He had walked straight past her to speak to me. Amber's voice came out quietly. Sir. General Vance stood upright and turned toward the table. His expression was neutral, but his tone was not. "Captain Hayes," he said calmly. Amber stiffened. "Yes, sir." He gestured slightly toward the screen. "Where did you get those logistics models?" Amber hesitated. "Internal research, sir." The general looked at the chart. Then he looked at me again briefly, and for a moment the room understood something Amber didn't. Because Amber had spent the entire morning trying to impress the most demanding officer in the command structure. And that officer had just addressed me using a private name that only one person ever used. Amber's face slowly lost its color as the realization began to form. The difficult general she had been trying to impress already knew exactly where those documents had come from. The room stayed silent after the general asked his question. Amber was still standing near the projector screen holding the remote, like it had suddenly become heavier. "Sir," she said carefully. "The models were developed during internal strategic analysis." General Vance looked at the chart again. Then he looked at the analysts sitting around the table. "Does anyone here believe this distribution model works?" No one answered. One of the logistics specialists finally spoke. "Sir, the transport capacity assumptions are unrealistic." Another officer added. "The redundancy removal would break the inspection chain." The colonel from procurement nodded. "And the predictive algorithm collapses if a single route experiences delay." General Vance turned his eyes back to Amber. "And yet you presented it as a finalized operational plan." Amber swallowed. "Sir, the framework represents a forward thinking." He raised one hand. Amber stopped talking. The general's voice stayed calm. "Captain Hayes." "Yes, sir." "Who wrote these documents?" Amber hesitated. For the first time since she entered the room, her confidence wasn't there. "I assembled them." General Vance looked at me briefly, then back at the screen. "These models contain compliance structures identical to internal audit templates." Amber didn't answer. The general stepped closer to the table. "Captain Hayes, are you aware that presenting unverified operational plans to Strategic Command is considered professional misconduct?" Amber's voice dropped. "Yes, sir." "And are you aware," he continued, "that copying restricted internal analysis without authorization is a security violation?" Amber's hands tightened around the remote. "Yes, sir." The room stayed quiet. General Vance looked toward one of the officers seated near the door. "Contact legal compliance." "Yes, sir." Amber spoke again quickly. "Sir, the intent of the proposal was innovation." The general's expression didn't change. "Innovation does not include stolen documentation." Amber looked at the floor. "And operational funding records show irregular spending associated with this project. That part came from my audit." Amber looked up again. "Sir, those expenses were related to presentation preparation." "Clothing purchases?" Amber said nothing. The general folded his hands behind his back. "Captain Hayes, effective immediately, you are removed from project authority pending investigation." Amber's face went pale. "Sir, that is not a discussion." He turned to the colonel. "Secure the project materials and freeze all associated accounts." The colonel nodded. "Yes, sir." Amber stood there without speaking. The presentation screen still showed the title slide. Disruptive Logistics Initiative. It looked less impressive now. General Vance gave one final instruction. "Captain Hayes will report to legal review this afternoon." Amber didn't move. Two security officers stepped forward quietly. The meeting ended. No one applauded. No one argued. People simply stood up and began leaving the room. Professional environments handle disasters quietly. I remained in my chair for another moment while the officers filed out. Amber was escorted toward the door. She didn't look at me, not once. The door closed behind her. The room finally became quiet again. General Vance walked over and sat in the chair beside mine. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he exhaled slowly. "Well," he said. "That was predictable." I nodded. She believed confidence would solve the math. He glanced at the empty screen. "It rarely does." A few minutes later, we left the room together. The hallway outside was calm, like nothing had happened. Military buildings are like that. Major career collapses can occur inside a room while the corridor outside remains quiet. The investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, the results were official. Amber had copied restricted internal documents. She had presented them as her own work. She had used operational funds for personal expenses, and she had attempted to bypass base security procedures. Those 4 things together were enough. Amber lost her rank. Court-martial proceedings began shortly after. News travels fast in military communities. Within days, everyone knew. The ambitious officer with the big logistics plan had destroyed her own career. Our parents learned about it the same way everyone else did, through quiet conversations and uncomfortable phone calls. 3 weeks later, they came to my office. My mother looked older than she had during the last dinner. My father stood behind her, silent as usual. Sloan, my mother said carefully, "Yes, we wanted to talk." I gestured toward the chairs. They sat down. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my mother finally said the sentence she had probably practiced all morning. "Amber needs help." "With what? The legal process?" I waited. "She made mistakes," my mother continued. "But she's still your sister." My father spoke quietly. "Maybe you could talk to someone." "About what?" "About the investigation." I looked at them calmly. Amber had never asked for help. Amber had never apologized. Amber had simply assumed the system would bend around her. My mother's voice became softer. "You work with the command structure. That's correct. Maybe you could influence the outcome." I leaned back slightly. "Influence how?" My mother hesitated. "You know people." That part was true, but not in the way she meant. For years, my family had believed Amber represented success, and I represented paperwork. Now they were asking the paperwork to solve the problem. I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered them with the same words they had used on me for years. "I'm just someone who takes care of herself." My mother looked down. My father nodded slowly. They understood. The meeting ended quietly. That evening, I walked across the base parking lot as the sun was going down. Training vehicles had left tracks across the pavement earlier that day. Dust clung to the lower edges of my boots. I heard footsteps behind me. Maverick caught up beside me. "Long day?" he asked. "Not particularly." We walked toward the gate together. He glanced at my boots. "You've been in the field again, compliance inspections." He nodded. "Someone has to keep the system honest." We reached the edge of the lot and stopped for a moment. Behind us, the base buildings stood in long rows under the fading light. For years, people had assumed Amber represented power, but real authority rarely announces itself. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need a stage. It simply stands quietly and waits for the truth to appear. Maverick looked at me briefly. "You handled this well. I handled my job." He smiled slightly. "That's why it works." We continued walking toward the exit. Dust still clung to my boots from the training ground, but each step felt steady. Not because of rank, not because of reputation, because integrity has a strange kind of weight. And once you learn how to carry it, you don't need anyone else's approval to keep moving forward. Before we end this story, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have helped Amber after everything she did? Or do some choices, have consequences that no one else should erase? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you enjoy stories about justice, integrity, and standing your ground, don't forget to subscribe for more. I didn't think much about Amber for a few weeks after everything ended. The base moved on quickly. That's how organizations like this work. One crisis ends, another task begins. Reports get filed, positions get reassigned, and people quietly return to their routines. But something about the whole situation stayed in my mind. Not the investigation, not the court-martial process. What stayed with me was the question people kept asking afterward. How did Amber get it so wrong? Most people assume the answer was arrogance. They weren't completely wrong, but arrogance alone doesn't destroy a career that quickly. The real problem was simpler. Amber misunderstood something that a lot of people misunderstand. She thought respect came from being impressive. She believed respect came from 3 things: speaking louder than everyone else, standing close to powerful people, and looking successful while doing it. From the outside, that approach can work for a while. Rooms respond to confidence. People often mistake certainty for competence. If someone speaks boldly enough, others sometimes assume that person knows what they're talking about. Amber understood that dynamic very well. She could walk into a room and make people listen, but attention and respect are 2 very different things. Attention is easy to get. Respect is harder. Respect usually appears only after someone has watched you work for a long time. Not during a speech, not during a presentation, but during the small, boring parts of a job that most people don't notice. Amber never believed those parts mattered. For years, she made the same joke about my job. "You count bolts." She liked saying it in front of people. It usually got a laugh, and technically she wasn't wrong. Compliance officers do count bolts. We check inventory lists. We review shipping logs. We read reports most people don't want to open. It isn't glamorous work. No one applauds when someone finishes a 30-page compliance review. But here's the interesting thing about systems. They survive because someone is doing the boring work. Aircraft fly because engineers check details. Supply chains function because someone tracks every crate. Hospitals work because administrators follow procedures no one outside the building ever sees. The quiet parts of systems are what keep them from collapsing. Amber believed those parts were unimportant, which is why she tried to remove them. Her logistics proposal eliminated redundancy checkpoints, removed inspection layers, compressed supply routes into a cleaner diagram. It looked efficient on a slide. But real systems don't run on slides. They run on reality, and reality is messy. Trucks get delayed, weather changes, equipment breaks, people make mistakes. When those things happen, the boring parts of the system are what keep everything from failing completely. Amber never understood that. To her, those steps looked slow, unimpressive, pointless, but those steps were the reason the system still worked. The strange thing is that this lesson isn't limited to military logistics. You see the same pattern everywhere. Someone walks into a company with big ideas. They promise transformation. They talk about efficiency and disruption. And sometimes those ideas are useful, but when someone tries to remove the quiet safeguards that hold systems together, the results are rarely impressive. They're usually chaotic. Amber also misunderstood something else. She believed confidence could replace competence. In her world, leadership meant speaking first and sounding certain. And again, that can work in the short term. Rooms respond to certainty, but expertise eventually exposes confidence that isn't backed by knowledge. When the analyst started asking questions during her presentation, Amber didn't fail because she was nervous. She failed because she didn't understand the structure she was trying to redesign. There's a rule I've noticed during my career. The people who talk the most about leadership are often the ones still learning how systems actually function. Real leaders usually ask more questions. They listen longer. They observe before they speak. Because they understand something important. Confidence is visible. Competence is quieter. But competence lasts longer. Another lesson from that situation has nothing to do with logistics. It has to do with people. Specifically, how we treat the quiet people in a room. Most workplaces have them. The person who doesn't dominate meetings, the one who reads documents carefully, the one who notices small problems before they become large ones. Those people rarely attract attention, but they often understand the system better than anyone else. And when something goes wrong, those are usually the people everyone turns to for answers. Not because they demanded authority, but because they earned trust. Trust builds slowly. It doesn't appear because someone wears the nicest uniform or hosts the most impressive events. It appears when people watch you handle responsibility over time. Amber believed respect could be created instantly, through presentation, through visibility, through association with powerful people. But real respect doesn't work that way. It grows quietly, the same way integrity does. And that brings me to something I want to say directly to anyone listening to this story. If you've ever been the quiet person in a room full of louder voices, don't assume that means you're less important. Some of the most valuable work in any system happens quietly. Accountants, engineers, analysts, logistics officers, people whose jobs involve details most others ignore. They're rarely the center of attention, but when those people disappear, everything around them starts to fail. Amber believed my job was small. She believed counting bolts meant I had no influence. But bolts hold machines together, and machines stop working when someone decides those small parts don't matter anymore. So if you ever find yourself in a room where someone is laughing at the quiet person doing the careful work, pay attention, because the quiet person might be the one who understands the system better than anyone else there. I've had a lot of people ask me the same question since everything happened. Not about Amber's court-martial, not about the project. The question people ask is simpler. Why didn't you stop her earlier? It's an interesting question because the truth is, I couldn't have stopped her. And even if I could have, it wouldn't have helped. One of the hardest lessons I learned growing up in my family is that you cannot protect someone from the consequences of their own choices. You can explain things. You can warn them. You can give them opportunities to walk away before things get worse. But at some point, every adult is responsible for the direction they choose. Amber made her choices very clearly. She chose shortcuts instead of learning the system. She chose attention instead of discipline. She chose confidence over honesty. None of those choices were made by accident, and none of them were caused by me. That's something I want to talk about for a moment because I know many people listening to this story have dealt with similar situations, especially inside families. Families can be complicated places. Sometimes they encourage the loudest personality. Sometimes they reward confidence more than character. And sometimes one person becomes the center of attention while another person quietly carries responsibility. I grew up in a house where Amber was the star. She was charismatic, outgoing, confident in every room she entered. Those traits made people admire her, but admiration is not the same as stability. Stability comes from habits, from discipline, from the things people do when no one is watching. For years, my family saw Amber's personality and assumed it meant she was the strongest one among us. They saw my quieter approach and assumed it meant I lacked ambition. That's a common mistake. People often confuse noise with strength. But real strength is usually quieter. It shows up in small decisions. The decision to follow the rules even when no one is checking. The decision to prepare carefully instead of rushing toward recognition. The decision to protect systems rather than trying to impress people. Another lesson that came out of this situation has to do with boundaries. For a long time, I tried to explain things to Amber. I tried to point out the problems in her thinking. I tried to help her understand the systems she was trying to manipulate. But there's a point where explanation stops being useful. If someone isn't interested in understanding you, repeating yourself won't change that. Some people don't want advice. They want validation. Amber didn't want to understand the system. She wanted to control it. And when someone wants control more than understanding the outcome is usually predictable. This leads to another question people sometimes ask. Why didn't you help her after everything fell apart? The answer to that question is also simple. Because helping someone escape consequences is not the same as helping them grow. Sometimes people call that kindness, but most of the time it's something else. It's enabling. When someone breaks rules and someone else erases the consequences, the lesson they learn is simple. They learn that rules are optional. They learn that someone else will always fix the damage. And eventually that belief leads to bigger mistakes. Amber didn't fail because I refused to protect her. Amber failed because she believed the rules didn't apply to her. And that belief eventually ran into reality. There's another part of the story that matters just as much as the conflict. It has to do with integrity. Integrity is one of those words people use often but rarely explain. To me, integrity is very simple. It means doing the correct thing even when the correct thing is boring. Even when it doesn't make you popular. Even when someone else is getting attention for doing something louder. Integrity is quiet. It doesn't create dramatic moments. It doesn't attract applause. But when a system starts to fall apart, integrity becomes the only thing that still holds its shape. That's true in military organizations. It's true in businesses. And it's true in families. Eventually, every system reaches a moment where appearances stop working, where confidence alone isn't enough, where someone has to ask the uncomfortable questions. When that moment arrives, the people who built their lives on shortcuts usually struggle, and the people who built their lives on discipline usually keep standing. That's not revenge. It's simply the long-term result of consistent choices. So if you're listening to this story, and you've ever felt like the quiet person in the room, the one who works hard while someone else gets the spotlight, here's something I want you to remember. The world often celebrates visibility first, but over time it depends on reliability. Visibility can open doors. Reliability keeps them open. If you build your life on discipline, knowledge, and honesty, the recognition might come slowly, sometimes very slowly, but when it arrives, it tends to last. Amber believed power came from standing closest to authority. What she never understood is that real authority is built on trust. And trust grows from consistency, from doing the same honest work day after day, even when nobody is watching. So let me ask you something before we finish. Have you ever been the quiet person in a room where someone else took all the attention, only to realize later that the quiet path you chose made you stronger in the long run? If that's happened to you, share your experience in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about justice, resilience, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one, and most of them start the same way, with someone who looks quiet, until the truth finally has its turn to speak.
Final note. This story is a work of fiction, but the valuable lessons we discuss are entirely real and continue to happen to many people every day. If this style isn't for you, that's perfectly okay. Please feel free to look for other content that better suits your needs.